This is Ancient African Wisdom. My name is DJ Stages. We have some reviews coming in and we're getting new people listening to this podcast. And so I like to put a lot of things in context as I go into today's episode of Ancient African Wisdom. But first of all, I like to welcome those who are here for the first time. Ancient African Wisdom is designed for you. You are the main focus of what we do. You are our fixation. We're fixated on you, that you are the excellence of the excellent. That's who you are. You're such a marvel that we are intrigued by your greatness, that we make this podcast to spur you on into the greatness that you are. And that you are not that because we said so, you already are. So we are attracted to you as a wise person. Hence, we make this podcast to find brothers and sisters all over the world, brothers in wisdom. So welcome aboard. And those who listen continually, we salute you because, hey, we're growing a family of wise people. If this world had a lot of wise people like you, man, think about all the changes. Think about the headline news. It would change. And so I am honored and so glad that I'm doing this podcast series for you. And thank you for listening. As I say this, I'm going to say some unique things today, and I want to put a lot of things in context because I know that not everybody has had the chance to listen to our introductory podcast. We devoted about half an hour explaining what ancient African wisdom is, and if you get a chance, you can listen. But if you didn't, I'm going to skim over it, but I give you a little insight into what ancient African wisdom is, because I know that words mean different things to different people. So for your sake, I will go over it again, except this time it will be the abridged version. So ancient African wisdom, the focus really is about wisdom. The wisdom transcends everybody. Wisdom respects no man. Wisdom is above everybody, meaning that it's available to everybody. Wisdom does not respect you where you come from or where you're going. Wisdom is above you. It's not above you because it towers over you. It's above you because it covers you in every facet of life. So when you need wisdom for living, it's available. When you need wisdom for relating with people, it's available. When you need wisdom for making choices about life, it's available. When you need wisdom for guidance, it's available. That's why it's above everybody and it doesn't respect anybody. Anybody who calls to wisdom, wisdom responds with the equal force without any distinction. That's the mainstay of this podcast. But because wisdom is so diverse and because wisdom is so grand, it is inconceivable that any person would speak about wisdom in a comprehensive, complete way. So this ancient African wisdom is contextualized by putting the word Africa before wisdom, by saying that this is the African version of wisdom, or a facet of wisdom that traces its foundation to the descendants of the people who identify themselves as Africans. So the wisdom that we focus on comes from a people of the African descent, or the Africans. And the African were a people who identify themselves as migrants. They migrated from a land called Mu. Some of you who are listening may know about Mu, and some of you have never heard of the land of Mu. You may have heard of Atlantis, or some of you haven't even heard of Atlantis. Before Africa or any other part of the earth, there were civilizations like Mu, Atlantis, Lemuria, and many other civilizations. So the branch of people who came and identified as Africans, which really means migrants or a land of migration. And they came to the continent where they concentrated, but they did not concentrate only in Africa, but also went to other parts of the world. And so taking a look at the ancient histories of the Americas and Asia and ancient Europe, you see the traces of those who identify themselves as Africans. Although all African people are descendants of Africans, there are more people who are not African who are descendants of the Africans. The wisdom that we focus on in this podcast draws from those who came from the land of Mu, whose language we still use, especially now on the continent of Africa. And then, of course, it's ancient African wisdom. So the ancient part of it is that it's the wisdom that has stood the trials and the tests of time, and it's still as good today as it was in its day. So that's the context. That's the wisdom that we talk about. The wisdom of those who are identified as Africans. I'm putting this all in context really to get you this, because I told you I was going to say something so unique that you haven't heard before. And if you've heard it, I'm going to make it clearer and clearer for you so you really understand. When you take a leap into history, as is known today, it has had different epochs. An epoch is the beginning of a philosophy dominated by a group of thinkers, and then it ends. And so the epoch that we are in today has for its foundation every single facet of its existence draws from the one facet of wisdom, which is called the African wisdom. Every form of science, every form of philosophy, every form of religion, every form of social setup and order, every form of political setup draws from the ancient African wisdom. Every one of them. Not a single way of doing life has drawn from anything else, if it's wise, than from the ancient African wise people. By making this claim, which I have substantiated constantly in these podcasts, I'm saying that the understanding of where we are and the understanding of where we're going depends on how we understand ancient African wisdom. Now, since all the way that life is organized is based predominantly on ancient African wisdom, it's imperative on everyone to understand ancient African wisdom, because the future of any people depends on their past. If you do not know where you came from, how do you know where you're going? Here's an analogy. Say you're blindfolded, put in a fast-moving car, and left somewhere in the middle of a highway. They take off the blindfolds, leave you with a car and keys. When you're in the middle of the highway somewhere, you got to figure out, where do I go? The first thing you want to know is that, where did I come from? Because you can't just start the vehicle and start driving any ways you do. You won't know where you end up. The first thing any logical person does is to look around them and see if there are any pointers to help them figure out where they came from. And so they would look up maybe to the sun and see where the orientation of the earth is, and say where the east is and where the west is. If the sun is not shining, they can look for signposts. If there are no signposts, basically what they are doing is that they're looking for pointers to figure out where they came from and see where they're going. Now imagine they came from a place where they had been flooded out and maybe everybody was taken out. So then they don't want to go back to that place. Or if they were taken away from their loving family, that's where they'll be looking to do, to go back to their family. So by not knowing where you came from, you do not know where you're going. Now, the whole world system is based on ancient African wisdom. But the whole world system has been blindfolded and thrown, as it were, in the middle of a highway. And for some strange reason, they're hurtling down, just heading somewhere, do not know what to do. I don't have to elaborate this, because the news tells you that the entire world is almost on a suicide mill run. The entire world is like on a mission to self-destruct. You read the headline news anywhere in the world, and it's not good news. This has happened for not just 1 year, but for decades and decades and decades. Bad news after bad news after bad news, and then people just keep going. To hold themselves back and say, but why is this what it is? When we sense within ourselves this awesomeness, that it's impossible for you to see bad unless you're good on the inside. It's impossible for a person to know light unless they know of darkness, but that they will not grovel themselves in the darkness or tolerate darkness, but they know that there's darkness, and therefore they will continue to walk in the light of knowledge and wisdom. That's the context of what I want to give you, so that when I say these things, they make sense to you. Now, those of you who have followed this Ancient African Wisdom podcast know that our focus has never been anything outside of ourselves, but we focus on the inside of ourselves, the greatness that we are. And all of us are amazingly crafted. But the basis of the expression of that greatness that we are is predicated on the understanding of the wisdom that's available to us. The structures of all there is based on an ancient African wisdom. And without understanding ancient African wisdom, it doesn't matter what you do. First of all, not acknowledging that everything is based on ancient African wisdom. Secondly, by not understanding it, it would be like that person in the analogy on the highway who was taken off the blindfolds and just keeps driving without caring where they end up. Just somehow, maybe one day, it will be a better day. So it's imperative not only for you who listen to this podcast, but for the entire world to awaken to this reality that what we have based our lives on is ancient African wisdom. Now let me give you an example. See, I told you I was going to make some claims that are so unique. There are those of you who listen who are religious people or people of faith. There are those of you who do not really subscribe to any faith or religion. But let me talk to those who have an inclination to faith or religion. Every form of religion that you have is drawn from the ancient African wise people. Every one of them. It may have been tweaked along the way. It may have been adjusted to appeal to a particular group of people, but its foundation is all in the ancient African wisdom. I have, as many people have, grown up in what we call the CE, the Christian era. The Christian era has based its beliefs on the canon version of the Bible, which is a compendium of 66 books, beginning with Genesis and ending with Revelation. The people who have perpetuated the Christian faith and religion started off with the ancient African wise people because they drew everything from the ancient African wise people. They took it to Europe and then tweaked it and represented itself, branded it as a certain version of Christianity, which then it went all over the world, dominating people. Some people who are of the African descent do not even know that their forefathers and foremothers were the authors of the religions that they subscribe to. They do not know that because when it was branded as, Christianity denominated in different parts of the world and for different reasons, it just, as many things do, meandered away from its source and took on its own life. And so there are those who do not know that the foundation of their religions is actually ancient African wisdom. And so you say, what's the point to all this? Well, the point to all this is this. I give an analogy to make sense because when you give an analogy, as the ancient African wise people used to do, when they tell a parable, you say much more than when you give a direct answer. So I'll give you an analogy. I could also simply give you a simple, direct answer, but you're wise people, so I want to engage you. When you go to a fancy restaurant and you sit down to have a 3-course meal, it takes between half an hour and an hour and a half before you're done. When you show up at a fast foods drive-through, like I did a couple of days ago, it took me about 15 seconds and I got everything. Now, the moral to this analogy is this. I cannot go to a fancy restaurant with the same expectation as I do to drive-through fast foods. I have a set of expectations that I have for a fancy restaurant compared to what I have for fast drive-through foods. Now, let me bring this home. So you would be frustrated to go to a drive-through and then you're told to wait for an hour and a half before you get your meal. That would be so frustrating. But this is what's happened to those who cleave to the Christian religion and Christian faith. When you read the tenets or the doctrines, what I would call in this analogy, the menu of the Christian religion and faith, their menu says that their God is a present help in time of trouble. Their menu says that their God is all powerful. Their menu says that they are to love their neighbors themselves. Their menu is so filled with good stuff, but the reality of their life doesn't match up. Its claims are just not what the people experience on a regular basis. And because of this, you've had so many denominations of the same thing with different habits and practices and doctrines, and some veer on to crazy. So by all this, if people were to stop and say, Why am I waiting for an hour and a half at a fast foods drive-through when I can go and sit in a nice restaurant and enjoy my meal? Why am I cleaving to this religion that doesn't produce what it claims? The reason they don't do that is because the claims of Christianity and the claims of any other religion are authentic. The claims are true. It's just that they have been taken away from their foundation and their proper interpretation, and what the people have been given are residues of the original thing. So the redemption, to those who now seek redemption, is that you have to go back to the original, and this is the ancient African wisdom, which was the birth of all religions. The same as democracy. Look at democracy all over the world. Every form of democracy is an aversion to the idea of democracy. Democracies are the worst abusers of the rights of people. Democracies are awful. They're not awful because their inherent views are awful. They're awful because those who have been entrusted with that have no idea where democracies came from or the idea of democracy came from. And therefore, what you get is what the ancient African wise people used to call people who have been hired. And what they do, they are hired for the show. It's unbelievable to look at somebody stand in public and speak untruth without blinking. Like they will say things that are so untrue, and yet they speak that in the name of democracy. It's the same with the idea of family. The people's idea of family, to put it mildly, is crazy. The idea of family came from the ancient African wise people. They knew what a family setup was, and they set it up according to the laws of nature, or to put it even better, according to the laws of divinity, according to the laws of that which created them. They put and set the laws of family so that when family is founded on these laws and they are understood and they acknowledged and understood, then these laws will sustain family and the family will be what it's intended to be. The greatest number of abuses anywhere in the world is among family members. Now think about that contradiction. It's not just that. It's business. It's the way people do business. A person will kill themselves in the process of making money and then spend the latter part of their lives trying to repair what they wrecked in the process of trying to get that money. And you see this in every generation because the understanding of money, the understanding of business is founded on ancient African wisdom. And when you do not acknowledge it and understand it, you go into this cycle of life. Now we have this global phenomenon where people are spending more time at home than they are doing at work. Some people are almost running crazy because they just don't know how to get about being by themselves. And yet the law of life is that you were born alone. Even when you're a twin, you're still born alone. And if you think about it, even if you sleep with somebody in the same bed, eat at the same table with somebody, or drink in the company of other people, you're still all by yourself. And when that day comes, you will be checking out on all by yourself. And now you don't know how to look after your own self when you're told to go and to be by yourself at home. It baffles me sometimes because I don't understand how it's hard for a person to be by themselves. Isn't it the greatest company ever? Think about it. You're the wisest person who's ever lived. You do not know that until you go within the recesses of who you are, explore them and see the marvel that you are. You will never know that until you do take inventory of yourself and spend time with yourself, invest in yourself. What value is it to you? Or anybody, and by the way, and I'm not going to preach to the choir as they say, but what value is it to a person to understand all there is to know about the birds and the sand on the seashore and the water in the seas? What value is it to you to know when the sun rises or the science of the sun's rays, or how to fix a car, or how to drive faster than the sound of light, and than the sound of light, to how to drive faster than the sound, the speed of sound, and to calculate everything and put it in, encapsulate in words that are so captivating. What value is it to you to write the greatest poem and you get the applause and the approbation of people, and yet you do not know the greatness of who you are? What value is it to you? So somebody may say, especially for those of you who are listening for the first time, you're like, okay, so how would I know how great I am? How would I know? Well, what I would say to you firstly is that, well, listen to all the podcasts. There's so much information for you. The mark of how great you are is not indexed by anybody. It's you who would know that. When you know that you know and it's beyond words, then you know. Now, the Ancient African Wisdom podcast gives you pointers, recommendations, and says that when you, for example, understand the effect of the sun on your body, if you understand the influence of the stars, when you understand the things that control and define your values, when you understand all these things, these are pointers that you are on the way of knowing the greatness that you are. So what the Ancient African Wisdom really does is to give you signs that when you follow these, you are on the way of discovering your greatness. But your greatness, your awesomeness, your amazingness is not cataloged by a particular list of things, as people who do not know wisdom do. Say they have a list of what they call the bucket list. I gotta get this and this and this, and when I'm done, then they get to that and they are as empty as they started. Now, having said all this, I want to bring all this to a close by making a rallying call to those of the African descent. Like I said at the beginning, wisdom does not respect any person. Wisdom is applicable and available to everybody who wants to be wise. But I also say that this form of wisdom has a strand of Africa or Afruka to it, and it's also a wisdom from antiquity. I want to make a rallying call to those of you who listen to us from different parts of the world, whether you are in Sweden or France or in the USA or in South Africa, in Libya or in Indonesia, those who listen to us in the island nations of the world, all the parts of the world who listen to us, those of you especially who are of the African descent. I'm making a rallying call to you by saying that the responsibility of the future of the world lies squarely at your feet. For generations and generations, you who were entrusted by your ancestors, the great wisdom that some of your ancestors passed on to the rest of the world, you who are entrusted with the wisdom that has undergirded all that we know today, you have, along the passage of time and the passing of seasons, you have forgotten who you were. And of course, there have been other people who have helped you along the way to forget who you are. I'm saying this as a rallying call to you that the responsibility of the world lies squarely at your feet. The idea of justice was initiated and proliferated by your ancestors. The idea of democracy, the idea of religion, the idea of sciences, the idea that everything that this world is balanced on was started by your ancestors. Some of you who listen have forgotten that that's the reality. And some of you who are of a religious or faith persuasion, I want to make this clear to you that the redemption, meaning the raising of value of the world, lies at your feet. Let me make some other bold claims. Now, you who live on the continent of Africa, now we had some reviews coming in. We are having some people now on the continent of Africa listening to this Ancient African Wisdom podcast. We're glad. But I also want to say to you that we're waiting on you. The world is waiting on you because for generations, you who live on the continent, who have been the conduits and the keepers of the wisdom and the power and the understanding of all that we are based on, you who have been the keepers have relegated your responsibility. And I know that you've had influences from those who have not meant well. But that doesn't take away the truth of the matter that you are still the torchbearers of the wisdom upon which this world is based. So you especially who are on the continent, the rallying call is to you to stir up within yourselves. What we want to hear coming out of Africa is wisdom. We don't want to hear any longer that dictatorships come out of Africa. We don't want to hear any longer that famines come out of Africa. We don't want to hear that diseases come out of Africa or violence come out of Africa. What we want to hear is what your ancient African wise people did, spreading the wisdom to the rest of the world. We want to hear you creating a fund that supports the welfare of other people all over the world. We don't want to hear you any longer as the the punch bag of anybody who wants to experiment on anything. We don't want to hear you as the dumping ground for all those who are of excesses in distraction. We want to hear you rise up to where you were, rise up to your responsibility, rise up and be the torchbearers that your ancestors were. And those of you who are in other parts of the world who are of the African descent, this is a good time for you to ignite within yourselves and practically put into expression the great wisdom that you are. This is not about living so well so you can buy a new car or live in a nice neighborhood or live to be an old person. You got to go back to the precepts of your ancient African wise forefathers and foremothers who had the power to live for thousands of years, who had the power to live above all forms of contradictions. Now, for those of you who may feel left out because I focus now on those of the African descent, I want to say to you again, just to remind you, this is wisdom. This is for you. It happened to have been entrusted with those of the African descent. And until those of the African descent rise up out of the ashes of all that has happened to them, this world has no hope. This world will keep rattling and hurtling down the highway, not knowing where they came from and not knowing where they're going. We will change the headline stories all over the world. And when those of the African descent remember that they are the vanguards of truth, that they are the vanguards of all the wisdom that is upholding this world. When they come to this understanding and when they awaken to this realization, the world will know where it came from and will forge a better way for a better tomorrow. On a very light-hearted note, I'd like to say thank you again for joining me on Ancient African Wisdom. My name is DJ Stages. Have a great day. Bye-bye.